Hello and welcome to my presentation about the experience of women journalists in Niger and Burkina Faso. This is part of my broader PhD project that is about the role of women journalists in conflict resolution processes. But today I want to talk about the challenges and opportunities of women journalists in particularly local media in Niger and Burkina Faso. So why studying women journalists? First and foremost, because there's a lack of scholarly research, particularly on the African continent, on the experiences of women journalists. And the research that does exist is mostly based on mainstream media in urban centers. So it lacks, there's a gap of the experience of women in more rural areas, conflict-affected areas, and in community media. I want to say just a few words about who is considered a journalist. Usually this is based on the legal frameworks of a country, and in the case of Burkina Faso, during the revolution of Thomas Sankara in the 80s, he opened up the profession to people who are not having a university degree in journalism. And until today, the law states that all persons who are working for more than 3 years in a media outlet as their main occupation, collecting, adapting, treating, and presenting information are considered professional journalists. However, the perception is a little bit different. So many presenters, animateurs, animatrices in French, in community radio stations do not perceive themselves as professional journalists, even though they fit the definition by law. And also many directors in radio stations do not consider many women journalists as such, but more as presenters only. So these different definitions, as well as the lack of data, makes it difficult to compare the evolution of women journalists over time. I found some data about Burkina Faso, but because they're also based on different samples, they cannot be directly compared. However, you can see that none of the percentages are above 28%. And today, especially in the radio landscape, it's more about the 20% at the right. If we look at higher decision-making positions, the percentage drops down to 5 to 10%. So you see that the percentages are rather low, also compared to South Africa or Eastern African countries. So who are these women who make it against all the possibilities into the media sector? And I conducted interviews with women journalists, 5 in Burkina Faso, 9 in Niger, between the age of 32 and 51. 6 of them were married, 3 separated, 2 divorced and remarried, 2 are single, and 1 widow. All but 3 have children, and their average experience is around 13 years. I also have to say that almost all of my interviewees had also training in conflict-sensitive reporting, so this might have also some influence on my findings. So let's start with the challenges they face in the media landscape. When we talked in the interviews about the main challenges, firstly, there were some general challenges coming up that were very important, which are not gender-related. So for community radios, these are especially the lack of resources, financial and material. But interestingly, also in Niger, there were a lot who talked about the reluctance of people to talk to the media, how difficult it was to get media in front of the microphone. This is even more so for women, because there are societal prejudices, traditional norms and values that make it more difficult for women to talk in public. And for married women also, there is this need to have the authorization of their husband still very important. But there are also an important inequality of access to resources between men and women. especially to access financial or technological resources to participate actively in the media. So this might lead to a lot of frustration also, because women seem often excluded from public debate. Now, when we talk about the challenges that are more related to gender for women journalists, then already a study at 1998 talked about, again, the societal prejudices, the stereotypes against women journalists that are very strong, but also religious and traditional norms that impede somehow the public speech of women. But there is also the very well documented global difficulty to somehow balance family expectations and job requirements, leading to a journalist from Burkina Faso to say that you have to choose either your family or your job. Another challenge that came up in the interviews was also the lack of support by other women for women journalists. And last but not least, paternalistic superiors who take decisions for women journalists on the ground of protecting them, particularly when the journalists are pregnant or have small children. Now, the situation is already difficult as such. Now, when we look at conflict-affected areas, there are another set of challenges coming in that applies both to male and female journalists. So on the one hand, we have the threats, direct threats, towards the journalists or the radio stations, the media, which often lead to self-censorship. But we have also administrative barriers and laws that impede the access to information. We have also a decreasing participation and decreasing revenue from the community because they are reluctant to put their names publicly in the media. And we have a general fear of retaliation against his own family or the community, for which journalists feel often responsible. So what does that mean now for women journalists? Let me say it in the words of a journalist from Burkina Faso. She said, "If we complain that we are not sent to some assignment, they say it is not safe for us, women. The security situation will even worsen that. Even men will not be sent like that anymore." So if the situation was already difficult before, it will also get more difficult in conflict settings for women. But now the question is, how do these women now, journalists now, overcome these barriers and take up and stay in the profession despite all these difficulties and challenges? The main factor, I think, was also the motivation, the passion that these women have for the profession. So it's really a passion to be a journalist. And it's also often linked to character traits, like women who said that they are very curious, they want to know, they want to discover things, know the world, they want to express and contribute to the society. But interestingly also, most of the interviewees talked about role models or mentors that encouraged them and supported them to enter the media sector and to stay in it. So these can be either other journalists, trainers, or even simply neighbors. When it comes to the role perception, so it looks a little bit different than in the global study Worlds of Journalism. The role as informers and educators are still present, though not as important. But what seems much more important for my interviewees were to give women a voice, then the role to be a mediator in the community and a change maker. And for instance, in this citation, a journalist in Burkina Faso said, I saw certain realities, certain injustice, and I told myself, if I were a journalist, I could treat this topic and make a real contribution to change. Now, beyond the motivation and role understanding, women journalists also talked about their particular opportunities as women journalists. And particularly in small radio stations where everyone has to do the same job. And therefore, they have also this opportunity to not be pushed into a specific corner or towards specific topics. So they have the opportunity to go beyond that. And they also talked about that it's easier for women to have access on the ground. Of course, with some exceptions, mostly on religious and traditional matters. But as you can see in this quote, a journalist in Niger said that their male journalist colleagues have to collaborate with them because for the women it is easier on the ground. It's easier for the women to slip in sometimes. And of course, the big opportunity is that it's easier for women to talk to other women. So for women journalists to have access to other women's voices. So from this results, the role understanding and the opportunities, so these women journalists in conflict-affected areas, they can also play an important role to support other women in these contexts. And particularly by making the voices of women affected by conflict heard and call for support upon authorities or NGOs, and also by raising awareness about the consequences of conflict on women. In the interviews, the women journalists also expressed ideas on how to do even better, how to get more women participating in the media, and how themselves as journalists become a role model. So in this first quote, a journalist from Niger said that it's important to treat a topic repeatedly from different angles so that women feel more comfortable and have the information they need to participate actively in the media. The second quote from Burkina Faso is also taking up this consideration about time. So take the time to make women feel comfortable to speak up, convince them, even if it's not easy, it is necessary. So there's this necessity to make the effort. And this last quote is also to ask women journalists to surpass themselves, to prove that being a woman is not a disadvantage, neither as a journalist nor in society as a whole. So I want to conclude my presentation with some concluding thoughts. On the one hand, about the opportunities that women journalists have, like how important it is to value their experience and to boost their confidence as such, but also for them to use the spaces and competences they build up over all these years to continue to transgress their assigned roles and social prejudices. But on the other hand as well, we need to critically engage with this tension that came out in the interviews. On the one hand, we have the women journalists who want to give voice to women, and on the other hand, we have some women who do not support that. So where does this lack of support come from? Where does this tension come from? It's about asking the question, who can speak for someone else? And we need more intersectional research to know what factors may come into play and what power relations are there existent. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very curious about your questions and contributions. Thank you so much.